Hey historians!
I'm Ava.
And I'm Madison. Welcome back to the front lines of history.
Wars are usually talked about in terms of dates and battles. We're here to talk about what happens after the explosions stop.
Today, we will be analyzing the statement that the effects of war on the role and status of women were mostly beneficial.
I will be arguing the positive using the Pacific theater of World War II.
While I argue the negative, using the Persian Gulf War.
Okay, let's start with some context. Before World War II, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression, and American society was built around clearly defined roles. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States was suddenly pulled into a global conflict that demanded total national mobilization. Nowhere was this more intense than in the Pacific, where war required enormous industrial output, long-term military commitment, and constant logistical support across vast distances. The Pacific War was not short or contained. It involved island-hopping campaigns, massive naval battles, and continuous production of ships, aircraft, weapons, and supplies. Millions of men were drafted or enlisted, leaving behind labor shortages at home just as factories and military bases were expected to dramatically increase production. The scale and urgency of the war forced the government and private industry to rethink how the nation's workforce was organized. To meet these demands, the United States expanded its definition of who could contribute to the war effort. Jobs once considered strictly male became essential wartime positions that had to be filled quickly. This shift did not come from social reform movements, but from necessity. The war disrupted long-standing economic and social structures in ways that could not easily be reversed once the conflict ended. World War II was a turning point because it blurred the line between the battlefield and the home front. Victory in the Pacific depended just as much on production, organization, and support at home as it did on combat overseas. That level of mobilization reshaped American society and created conditions that would have lasting consequences long after the war ended.
Okay, now for some Persian Gulf War context. Nearing the end of the 1980s, the Cold War was coming to an end and the United States was finding its role in the world. The country was no longer focused on preparing for a long-term conflict with the Soviet Union, but was instead focused on responding quickly to regional crises that threatened global stability. The Middle East became especially important because of its oil reserves and its influence on the global economy. In August 1990, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. This invasion raised fears that Iraq would continue expanding its control over neighboring countries and gain greater influence over global oil supplies. In response to this, the United States organized a large international coalition supported by the United Nations that would force Iraqi troops out of Kuwait and further prevent aggression in the region. The Persian Gulf War was fast but highly demanding. One of the two stages of the war was named Operation Desert Shield, which involved the rapid deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, and supplies to the Persian Gulf region. This was followed by Operation Desert Storm, which combined weeks of airstrikes with a short ground campaign that quickly overwhelmed Iraqi forces. Although the combat ended in a matter of weeks, the scale of preparation and coordination was massive. The Persian Gulf War relied heavily on technology, planning, and consistent logistical support. Troops operated in harsh desert conditions and depended on communication networks, transportation systems, and medical support to function effectively. Success depended not only on combat, but also the ability to sustain operations around the clock. The Persian Gulf War was a turning point because it reflected how modern warfare had changed. Military success depended on speed, organizations, and coordination across many different roles, showing that contemporary wars were shaped as much by support systems and infrastructure as by fighting on the battlefield.
Now for some analysis on the role of women in each war. World War II marked a major turning point in the role and status of women, not because the government suddenly embraced gender equality, but because the scale of the war made traditional gender roles impractical. The Pacific War demanded constant production of ships, aircraft, weapons, and supplies, while millions of men were deployed overseas. As a result, women became essential to the war effort rather than supplementary. On the home front, women entered industrial and technical jobs previously considered unsuitable for them, especially in shipyards, aircraft factories, and defense plants supporting Pacific operations. These positions required skill, endurance, and responsibility, directly challenging assumptions about women's physical and intellectual capabilities. Despite lower pay and frequent discrimination, women's performance gradually shifted male attitudes in the workplace. Women also served in the military in unprecedented numbers, particularly in nursing, intelligence, communications, and aviation support. In the Pacific, military nurses worked near combat zones under dangerous conditions, while others managed logistics and communications critical to sustaining long campaigns across vast distances. Their support expanded ideas of what counted as meaningful military contribution. Although many of these roles were labeled temporary and women were expected to leave them after the war, the impact was lasting. Women gained financial independence, skills, and public visibility, and the war undermined the belief that women were unfit for demanding work or military responsibility. Even when many were pushed out after 1945, expectations had changed, laying the groundwork for later demands for equal pay, workplace rights, and expanded military participation.
Wow, World War II really did benefit women in a variety of ways. But I did have a question. While World War II women proved themselves capable in factories and near combat zones, how much of that progress actually lasted after the war, given that most women were expected to leave their job once the men returned?
Well, that's a fair point because many women were expected to leave their jobs after the war. However, the lasting progress of World War II wasn't about women keeping every position they held during the war. It was about permanently changing how women's abilities were viewed. For the first time, women had proven on a massive national scale that they could handle skilled industrial labor, military responsibility, and financial independence. Even when women were pushed out after 1945, the idea that they were naturally unfit for these roles no longer held up, and that shift in perception mattered more in the long run than immediate job retention.
Okay, now let's move on to analysis for the Persian Gulf War. This war increased women's participation in the U.S. military, but these changes were not mostly beneficial to their role or status. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the United States rapidly deployed over 500,000 troops to the region. This buildup created an urgent need for support and technical personnel, leading to the development of approximately 33,000 women. Women were included out of necessity rather than a shift toward equality, and their expanded presence did not come with equal authority, protection, or recognition. Women served in critical roles such as directing artillery, flying helicopters, maintaining tactical communications, and providing medical and logistical support. Many of these jobs placed them close to combat zones, especially as missile attacks and shifting front lines made clear distinctions between combat and non-combat unrealistic. Despite these risks, women were still officially barred from combat, and Navy women were excluded from offshore carrier assignments. This meant women were exposed to danger without being granted the same status or opportunities as men. Daily conditions further revealed how unequal this inclusion was. Women reported exposure to extreme heat, sandstorms, oil fires, chemical malnutritions, depleted uranium, vaccines, and PB pills, often while wearing faulty or ill-fitting protective equipment and boots not designed for them. Many experienced serious health issues during deployment, including migraines, vomiting, respiratory infections, and UTIs. Beyond physical conditions, women faced a quote-unquote good old boy system, sexual objectification, peeping incidents, and military sexual trauma. Some also reported reproductive issues, including miscarriages and long-term health conditions affecting their children. Although the war increased visibility, it did not result in lasting institutional change. President George H.W. Bush's reference to the troops as, quote, our sons and daughters, reflected shifting language but not equal treatment. Carol N. Rivers, a female officer, later noted that she was offered the option to avoid deployment because of family responsibilities, an option never offered to male officers, which she refused. While Rivers and others described personal growth, resilience, and leadership after the war, these individual gains did not translate into improved status or equality. Combat restrictions, harassment, and health risks persisted, showing that the Persian Gulf War expanded women's roles without producing mostly beneficial outcomes.
Okay, so the hardships women faced show that the Persian Gulf War wasn't completely beneficial for them, but I also have a question. Women served in critical roles during the Gulf War, even though they faced health risks, harassment, and continued combat restrictions. So do you think this shows that their contributions were truly respected since men can face the same hardships?
While it is true that women faced many of the same dangers as men during the war, such as missile attacks, extreme heat, and harsh desert conditions, they also faced challenges unique to their gender. Specifically, many had to follow strict cultural rules in Muslim countries, like needing male escorts and dressing modestly while still performing crucial military duties. And as I mentioned before, they dealt with sexual harassment, military sexual trauma, and peeping incidents on top of physical risks, and some experienced reproductive issues, including miscarriages and long-term health effects on their children. While women were essential to operations, these added burdens show that their service involved more hardships than men, and that military relied on them without fully respecting or protecting them. So, looking back at World War II and the Persian Gulf War, it's clear that women's experiences were very different in each conflict.
Right. In World War II, women stepped into essential roles both at home and in the military. They gained skills, independence, and challenged ideas about what women could do. Even though many had to leave these jobs after the war, the progress they made in perception and opportunity was lasting.
On the other hand, during the Persian Gulf War, women's roles were much more limited. Most served in support positions far from the front lines, and the social impact was smaller.
So, while both wars had advantages and disadvantages for women, the overall effect of World War II was mostly positive.
And the Persian Gulf War shows that progress can be limited when the scale or necessity of women's involvement is smaller.
In the end, history shows that women's contributions depend not just on their abilities, but on the opportunities and circumstances that allow them to shine.
Thank you for watching, historians. We'll see you on the next episode
on the front lines of history.